Hey, welcome back to another amazing interview. Today we're chatting with Dr. Kent Vliet, a top biologist when it comes to crocodilians, especially with the behavior of the American alligator. In this discussion, we're going to hear how Dr. Vliet got started in his career with crocodilians. We're going to talk about his role currently in taxonomic revision with some of the new cryptic species of crocodilians that are being named, as well as taking a look at his work in the early days when he was featured in a National Geographic special. So make sure you stay to the end. You're not going to want to miss that part. I also want to add that in the description, I'm putting a link to Dr. Vliet's book. It's a must-have for anybody who's interested in learning more about these amazing reptiles. So don't go anywhere. I'm Mark Perpetua, and you're watching Croc Chat. All right, well, today we get the pleasure of chatting with Dr. Kent Vliet. Now, we've talked to a lot of people so far about crocodilians in general, especially American crocodiles, but Kent is the guy you want to go to when it's time to talk about the American alligator. Kent, thanks so much for joining me.
Happy to do it.
Thank you. How long have you been studying the American alligator?
A long time, my whole career. I began in 1980, and I retired 3 years ago, but I'm still messing with crocodilians. I haven't done anything with alligators in a couple of years, but I worked with zoo animals a lot, and so I'm sure I'll get back to them sooner or later.
But in the early days, it was mostly alligators. Is that something you strived for? You wanted to work with alligators or crocodilians, or did it kind of just come up as you went along?
No, it really fell into my lap. I had grown up in Oklahoma. I got into reptiles, just catching snakes and lizards out there. I lived in Norman, which is a university town, and my father was a professor of law at the University of Oklahoma. So we had as family friends George Lynn Cross, who had been president of the University of Oklahoma for like 25 years, but had long since retired. And I ended up on a car ride with him up to some function in Oklahoma City, and then just talking, he realized I not only had an interest in reptiles, but I had a pretty good knowledge of reptile natural history. And so the next week, I was 14, I was still in junior high. The next week, he took me to the zoology department at the university and introduced me to the chair of that department. And I started working in his research lab with one of his grad students. And we were working on thermoregulatory behavior, the importance of the pineal eye, that little organ on the top of their head, the importance of the pineal eye on thermoregulatory behavior in those things. And so I spent several months doing that, where I would maintain the lizards, and I'd take the lizards and insert thermocouples into their cloaca and tape that thermocouple in place. And then we had 2 or 3 arrays that were thermal gradients. So there was a cool end and a very hot end, and the lizards could pick where they would settle in that array. And once they had, we'd record whatever temperature it was, And then it was a matter of covering the pineal eye with little bits of aluminum foil so that blocked the signal, or we would remove the pineal eye surgically and put them in and see what effect it had on what temperatures they selected. So I did that for a few months, but there was a fellow at the university that studied reptile behavior, a fellow named Charles Carpenter. He's very well known among academics, at least, in behavioral studies of iguanid lizards and the push-up and head bob displays that they do to one another, and the associated, like dewlap displays and that sort of thing. He had ultimately studied every species of iguanid that was known at the time to look at those sorts of behaviors. And so I started working in his lab, which was a fantastic place. It wouldn't be possible anymore with our IACUC regulations, animal care regulations. He had a few hundred reptiles in his research lab. And some of them were there for active projects, but others were just there so that if a student was interested in doing a project, they could pick a species and kind of pick a project with it. Or if somebody was working in the lab and they saw some of the reptiles doing something especially interesting, they could study that. And so I started working with geckos, but I was working mostly with gliding geckos and banded geckos, and trying to look at their social displays. And so I did that for some time. I did a few other things. I looked at kissing cockroaches and stuff like that, but my interest was always in behavior. And so for college, I stayed there in Norman to save money, and I continued working in that lab until I got my bachelor's degree in zoology. And then I had to find a place to go for graduate study. And with Dr. Carpenter's help, I picked out like 8 universities that had particular people doing work with reptiles that I would have liked to work with. And I ended up coming down here to Florida, to University of Florida in Gainesville, to work with Dr. Walter Offenberg, who was the curator of herpetology at what is now called the Florida Museum of Natural History. But his research interests were pretty widely set. I mean, he was a paleontologist, and he worked on lizards and snakes and turtles of ancient Florida. But he's probably best known for working with the Komodo dragon, the behavioral ecology of the Komodo dragon. And he really became a monitor lizard specialist, but beginning with the Komodo. And he would write scientific papers as well, but he typically would finish off each one of those studies with a book, a detailed book on the behavior and ecology of, in this case, Komodo, and then Komodo monitors and their reproduction and what they ate and growth and all that sort of thing. And so that's who I was working with. And my intention when I came to Florida was to continue working with geckos, with the idea that I would travel someplace to work with geckos. But I did not come up readily with a good project. And so Dr. Offenberg had gone over to the St. Augustine alligator farm which is a zoo on the northeast coast of Florida in the town of St. Augustine. And he'd gone over there for a couple of weeks at the invitation of Ross Allen, who any old time herpetologist would know his name. I'm not sure too many young herpers know who he was, but he had a research and exhibit facility for reptiles on the Silver River in Silver Springs, just east of Ocala, Florida. But he did a lot of stuff with people, and he was quite well known. And at the time, he had become the director of shows at the St. Augustine Alligator Farm. And so, and he and Walt Offenberg were old friends. So Walt had Ross Allen had invited Walt over to see the alligators bellowing and courting and that sort of thing. And just before I got to Florida, Walt had spent a couple of weeks there taking field notes, making observations, writing down ideas. And so when I was coming up short on an idea for a project for geckos, he gave me those field notes that he had made and told me to analyze those and see what I thought, which I did. And I had very, very little experience with alligators at the time. I'd seen them. You can't live in Florida without seeing alligators. But I had seen alligators. I had spent a couple of summers at the field station for the University of Florida, the biological station on Lake Texoma in southern Oklahoma. And they had a couple of captive alligators there that had lived like 30 or 35 years in a concrete enclosure, cinder block wall enclosure. It was maybe 4 feet by 8 feet at most. And these things had been small little hatchlings when they first went in there. But they had continued to live in that same enclosure for many years, and they had become runted by the lack of available space. So they were 35-year-old alligators, which should have been, more or less as big as they were ever going to get. But they weren't. They were 4 or 4.5 feet in length. And so I took care of them 2 summers. And I'd have to clean the enclosure. I'd have to catch them and put them in like a stock tank and then move them back. So I had a little bit of handling experience, but that was about it. And so anyway, to take my long story and make it a bit longer, I decided I would work on alligator courtship, at least for one season, with Dr. Offenberg. And so that winter, the winter of 1980 and 81, or 281, I had to go over to the alligator farm and introduce myself and explain to the owner what I wanted to do. And I wanted to make observations of behavior. They had a man-made pond in the back, but it was, it had natural vegetation in it. It was kind of a semi-natural pond that had 165 adult alligators in it. But the important thing was it had a boardwalk running down the length of it, in the center of it. And because the alligator farm is a tourist attraction, there were crowds of people going up and down that boardwalk every day. And gators basically just ignored those people. So I would be able to make behavioral observations from that boardwalk and see the animals quite well. And I carried binoculars in case they were kind of far away from me so I could see details. But I wanted to make observations of individual alligators. I needed to know who each individual alligator was. And so I could look at the effects of sex and size and past relationships and that sort of thing. So I wanted to put those big cattle ear tags that you see hanging off of, cows in the field that have a big number on them. I wanted to put those on the tail of these alligators. And it would have been nice to have it farther up on the body because courtship behaviors tend to be associated with the head and neck of each other. And I was worried that it would be hard to see that number at times. And it was at times, but I got the number off of each individual in my recorded observations in way more than 90% of the cases. While they were interacting with one another, each individual would kind of pop its tail up out of the water long enough for me to see that number. But that required me to go in that first winter and catch those 165 alligators and measure them and sex them and affix these tags to them. And so I had to get the permission of the owner to do that to his alligators. And I mean, he wasn't a total pushover, but he has always been open to people making use of his facilities. So he gave me permission to do this. And then I had to go find somebody on the farm that knew how to catch alligators and ask them if they could show me, because I had to put these tags in the tails of these things. And so that first fellow was a guy named Tim Williams. And then there was another fellow there named Mark Wise. And the two of them basically showed me how they caught alligators. They weren't super experienced catching these really big alligators out of that back lake. I mean, they had caught them because that's why the gators were back there. They had gotten them from someplace else and put them in there, but they hadn't spent a lot of time doing that. They mostly caught smaller animals to do shows. They would do wrestling shows back then with 6 or 7 foot alligators in a pen. So it didn't take very long, maybe just a few weeks, before I had gotten more experience than either of them catching these gators in the swamp. Just because I had to do it, and they had plenty of other things to do at the alligator farm than go out and try to get a rope on those animals out in the lake. And so I was catching these things. I was taking students over from Gainesville to participate because I needed, strong arms and people to tote materials and write data down and that sort of thing. So I'd take a group over, and we were doing this essentially in December through February, which was cold. The alligators weren't really doing anything. They were sluggish, which I had hoped would benefit us in catching them. But the point in doing that was that I wanted there to be some separation of time between when we were harassing them to measure them and put tags on, and when I was back there to watch the natural behaviors of bellowing and head slaps and courtship and, nest construction and that sort of thing. And so, the biggest problem once I knew how to catch animals was that alligators are smart, and they were perpetually figuring out the techniques I had just come up with to catch the animals because my old techniques wouldn't work. They would see that and they'd figure out how to avoid it, and so I'd have to come up with something new. And so that through each year, they became harder and harder to catch. And the other problem there was that we had no place to put animals once we had caught them and put tags on them. So we had to just throw the tagged animals back into the lake where the untagged animals were. And then I had to wade through the lake and pick up tails and see if they had a tag on them or not. And if they did, I just let them go. But if they didn't, I had to work to secure that animal one way or another. Usually by, if it was a big animal, I would I carried a rope in my mouth and I had a hold of the tail, and I would let them swim off and pull me along. And then I would just crawl up their body until I was laying along the top of them on their torso. And then I would get my rope kind of sorted out and flip it over their head and bring it back to behind their jowls. You can see on the poster behind you that alligators have big jaw muscles behind their jaws. And so they have these great big jowls. And so if you can get a rope behind that and cinch it up, they really cannot get out of that. And so I would do that. I'd flip a rope over it and tighten that noose. And then I would just slip off the alligator and let it swim away while I was feeding the rope out. And then I would let it know it was caught, but it was 20 feet away at that point. And I'd pull it over to the shore, and then we would work it up and let it go.
That is some story.
Great. Yeah,
well, especially making the jump from geckos to just figuring out how to catch full-grown adult alligators.
Yeah, but I still love geckos. And, there is still so much work to be done on geckos because they are so complex in their social displays. Mm-hmm. And what I would do if I weren't doing crocodilians, what I would have spent time doing is a gecko project where I used captive geckos and look at the vocalizations and body posture displays that they use, and try to use those as taxonomic corollaries to how we understand them to be related to one another. They're fascinating animals. But when I was catching all the, sorry?
I said they're all fascinating at some degree, whether they're little or big.
Doing all that catching of animals, of the alligators, was an adrenaline rush, and I just kind of got addicted to that. And thinking about catching small lizards or doing something with turtles or something like that. Not that there's anything wrong with that. It just didn't seem as exciting to me as working with crocodilians. And I've worked with in some way or another, I've worked with every species of crocodilian now. Not all, certainly not all in the wild. I do a lot of work with captive animals, but I haven't even worked with, well, I've come pretty close to working with every species in captivity. There are a few species that that we now recognize as being different. They're cryptic species. So, for instance, the dwarf crocodiles of Africa, we used to think was one species with two subspecies. And we now recognize there's at least 3 species there. And so I've worked in museums as well with preserved animals and with skulls, and looking at the detailed anatomy of the skull to look for differences between these cryptic species, which is not easy. They call them cryptic for a reason. they really do look a lot alike.
Well, I know that the 2 species are already accepted, but you're currently working right now on the 3rd, aren't you?
Yeah. So there's the dwarf crocodiles have been known since the early 1800s, known to science. And they were described as the genus, well, it's going to get too complex. So the species now, the genus is Osteolaemus. And the species that we have recognized for a long time is called Osteolaemus tetraspis. And then in the late 20s and early 30s, an expedition to the Congo caught another species of crocodile. And that was published in a book on the reptiles of the Belgian Congo. And they called that Osborni, Osteolaemus osborni. And it was originally it was described as a separate species, but that got relegated to just a subspecies of Osteolaemus tetraspis very rapidly. And so for the past 75 years, more or less, those two taxa are what we recognize. But maybe 15 years ago, a biologist named Mitch Eaton was mostly looking at the use of wildlife as game meat in markets in Central and West Africa. And he found a lot of crocodiles there, and he would buy bits of tissue, or sometimes he would buy a whole animal from at these markets. And he did molecular work on those, and many of those markets had this Osteolaemus osborni, the one from the center of the Congo. And so he got a lot of data from that, and the ones that kind of bordered the Congo to the west, which were real Osteolaemus tetraspis. And then he had some specimens from West Africa, like from Ivory Coast and the Gambia and that sort of thing. And so he found that the dwarf crocodiles out in the western part of Africa, what we would call the Upper Guinea biogeographic zone, those were confused as Osteolaemus tetraspis, the species that everybody recognized, which were living in the lower Guinean biodiversity zone. And so those were different from one another, and both were different from the osborni living in the Congo basin itself. And Osborne eye was as different as either of those other two were from each other. And so that taxon was raised to a species. And so we now recognize 3 species of dwarf crocodiles. We had previously recognized the fact that what were being called Nile crocodiles in West Africa were actually not Nile crocs. So that's now recognized as a separate species. And then once we had recognized those 2 things, we decided to look at African slender-snouted crocodiles because they basically lived in that same region. And we said, whatever barrier allowed these crocs to differentiate from one another must have occurred with slender-snouted crocs as well. And so we looked at slender-snouted crocs. This work has been driven mostly by Dr. Matt Shirley from Florida International University. And so he had developed a pretty good network of biologists in Central and West Africa using students from universities in the countries that the animals were in, and training them and equipping them and so forth. And so once we decided to look at slender-snouted crocodiles, he just had his people all over Central and West Africa go out and catch crocodiles, take measurements, take photographs, take blood from them for molecular studies. And we found those to be distinct also. So in the span of about 15 or 20 years, we recognize that our understanding of the diversity of crocodiles in Africa went from 3 species, the Nile croc, the slender-snouted croc, and the little dwarf croc, to 7 species, 2 that had originally been confused with one another as Nile crocs, 2 slender-snouted crocs, and 3 dwarf crocodiles.
Yeah, I remember back in the 80s, I don't know where the new species were first, but back in the 80s, I remember learning 21 species, and then it slowly went 22, 23. At last count, when I put together my small book, it was at 27, but with the 3rd species of African dwarf, that would make it 28 now.
It would, if
but it's still growing.
It would if I was completely convinced about a couple of those species. So I'm the head of a group within, it's a thematic group for taxonomy and identification within the IUCN crocodile specialist group. So I have a group of about 40 or 50 biologists. Some of them are paleontologists, some are anatomists, some are molecular biologists. And our job is to advise the crocodile specialist group as to our certainty of the taxonomy of the crocodilia, so that the croc specialist group can then argue for the protection of endangered species or so forth within CITES and the Red Book and so forth. And so currently I'm only recognizing 26 species of crocodilians, but there are 2 more that may well be their own species, or I should say, there are at least 2 more that may well be their own species. They've had some work done on them. People have proposed names for them. one of these crocs is in New Guinea, and it was named Crocodilus hallway after Phil Hall, a biologist who was at the University of Florida but has since passed away. The paper describing that new species of New Guinea crocodile, I felt, and many of the people on my taxonomy committee felt, was not an adequate description of that crocodile or the differences of that crocodile and the existing crocodile in New Guinea, that freshwater crocodile. There's also saltwater crocodiles there. So it was not a sufficient description of the diagnostic differences between those two crocodiles, and it had a very small sample size of genetic analysis in the paper. 200 years ago, people did not have genetic analyses to show differences between species when they were naming them. It's not actually a requirement, but it's so ubiquitous now, and it has been so beneficial to us in understanding relationships among living crocodilians, and as well as every other group of animal and many plant species, that we just felt like that paper had fallen short of convincing us as a committee that those two were different. And so that name is still sitting there. There's another species that is even more problematic because we're not sure if it's actually distinct from another species, and we're not sure that it exists anymore. And so it's a little nebulous. That's a crocodile from Borneo called Crocodilus raninus.
Okay. Yeah, that one I got to admit I haven't heard of, at least not as an extant species. So I didn't know we were going to go in this direction in taxonomy and naming and DNA analyses, but I did ask this in some of my first interviews. One was with Dr. Tejas from the CRC, and another one was with Joe Wazalewski. And at that time, this would have been last fall maybe, there was a proposal, I think there were even papers somewhere on the internet, that two new species of American croc deserve recognition I think they were on islands or off the coast of Yucatan.
Yeah, that's right. They have been proposed as distinct from American crocodiles in Central and Northern South America. And they've been proposed to be distinct from one another, even though these two islands, they're the biggest islands just south of the Yucatan, in the Caribbean basin. But the islands aren't that far apart, and they aren't that far from the Yucatan. There's not a whole lot of mangrove on that side of the Yucatan anymore, so they're in a whole bunch of good habitat there. But these crocs can move hundreds of miles, and these crocs are saltwater crocs, sort of not that they're the same species as the saltwater croc in Australasia, but they are capable of living for relatively long periods of time in saltwater, and they're capable of traveling great distances between islands. So we are going to have another meeting in Morocco in May of this taxonomy group, and we will talk about those two. I'm a little perplexed by those. The people who made that paper are very good biologists. If you read their methods, they knew what they were doing. The science looks like it was well done. I'm just surprised by the results. And so I'm a little leery to jump on the bandwagon yet.
Well, with the current way of analyzing the DNA, and the fact that American crocodiles do travel so far over large expanses, what are the chances of it just being other crocodile DNA from interbreeding with either Cubans or more or less?
That is certainly a possibility. We know that this species, the American crocodile, often will hybridize with other members of the genus Crocodilus when they come together throughout the Caribbean. There is a unique species of crocodile in Cuba, which is pretty rapidly facing extinction because of this introgression with American crocodile genes. Morelet's crocodile in Central America also has American crocodile genes in it. You know, it's getting harder and harder to find really good pure Morelets, at least in the Yucatan. If you go down into Guatemala or maybe southern Belize, away from the coast, they may be more pure. But this is a concept worth talking about, because most people know enough about biology and speciation that they think that two species can't interbreed with one another. And yet we're talking about these crocs that we recognize as two species, but they are readily interbreeding with one another. And they're not only interbreeding with one another. If you take the babies from those hybrid crosses and either put them with one another or put them with one of the parental species, they can produce babies as well. So there's multi-generational hybridization in these crocs, which, in a lot of species, like in mammals, we would be highly suspicious of that behavior. And I think the way to explain this is either one, that we all have completely fooled ourselves that these were real species, and they really aren't. They're just, ecological morphotypes that are the same species, and they can breed with one another, which I'm just putting out there to say that somebody could say that was a possibility. I don't believe that. The alternative is that crocodilians just didn't get the memo that that real species are supposed to be unable to breed with another species. I think the lessons we've learned from doing the molecular work with crocodilians is that they are different from one another, but the rate of genetic change that occurs over time is probably less than a tenth the rate that mammals or birds might be changing in isolation from one another. And so they just, good species can't interbreed because they have ultimately developed genetic or sometimes also morphological differences from one another that prevent them from being able to breed. There's been selection for them to differentiate enough from one another that they just aren't capable of of producing healthy hybrid offspring. And so then if we look at the genetic work that has been done, and we do have whole genomes for a few species of crocodilians, certainly not all of them, but we have whole genomes for saltwater crocs and American alligators and Indian gharial and some caiman. And, we're getting enough of that data to understand that the rate of genetic differentiation in crocodilians is very slow. And so if you think about these hybrid isolating mechanisms, those have to develop over time. And so in mammals, they may develop very rapidly within, 100 generations or even less. But in crocodilians, they're going to develop much more slowly. And so it really shouldn't surprise us that when these two species come together initially, and we don't know how long this has been, it's probably been several 100,000 years. But when they first come together, they just are not going to develop these hybrid mechanisms for blocking the development of a zygote or fetus in the egg. And I think that's kind of telling about, I think that's a story about crocodilians as a whole. They're long-lived animals. They've been around for millions of years. Even the families of crocodilians we have today are probably 70 to 80 million years old as compared to, our family, the hominids, which may be, I don't know what the current estimate is probably 12 or 13 million years. And so they're just built on a different clock mechanism than mammals and birds are. They take it slower. That genetic divergence takes longer to develop over time.
Yeah, that's an amazing thing to think about, and you never know where our conversations are going to go when we start talking about them. Not just you and I mean in general on this channel. Yes. I mean, but very little questioning from me. You brought us down whole story of evolution, genetics, taxonomy, and I really appreciate that. But I do want to get back to alligators just for a second.
Yes,
one because
led you astray.
Well, no, that's okay, because, I love talking about all crocodilians, and I want to give you the chance to talk about all the crocodilians you work with, especially what you're doing now. That was a great deal of information, especially on Osteolaemus. But, of course, I do want to plug your book for you.
Oh, thank you.
On the American alligators. This is a wonderful work of your entire career, of what you've learned. And, of course, mine is autographed. Thank you. However, I'll make sure I put the link for that. So anybody who's out there watching, I also have to bring up, I don't know if you get tired of hearing this one, but because it leads all the way back to your beginning, I have to bring up Realm of the Alligator.
Oh, yeah.
And I got to point out to people, if you want to see Kent doing some of that original research, it's still available on YouTube. I don't know how else to find it. I used to have a VHS copy of it, and that has either got eaten or broken over the years through a tape. And I don't know who out there might still have a VHS player, but you can find Realm of the Alligator in its entirety, and that is a National Geographic special featuring Kent doing his early research on the reproductive behavior of the American alligator, which again took place at St. Augustine Alligator Farm.
part
How
of
did
it
it
was,
how did it become part? So we know the story of how you got into doing the alligator research, but how did it become part of National Geographic?
um, that's a good question.
Sometimes things just happen.
It's a kind of circuitous. There is a film company still in existence called Oxford Scientific Films, and they're from Oxford, England. And the company was originally made up of former faculty from Oxford University who had become interested in making films to show behaviors or odd anatomical functions and that sort of thing in the lab. And they just became knowledgeable enough about filmmaking that they broke off from the university and created this company. And one of those original fellows was a guy named John Paling. And eventually, after making numerous films for Oxford Scientific Films, he broke away from them and he moved to the US and he came to Florida. And he had a contract to create an educational film. So nowadays, National Geographic has entire channels that they have to fill with films all day long. And in those old days, National Geographic had TV specials, which were 1 hour films. There were 4 of them each year. And then they made educational films that were like 16 millimeter films that you'd put on the projector in the classroom and do that. And so John Paling, one of the first things he did when he came to the US was get a contract with National Geographic to do an educational film on the ecology of the Okefenokee Swamp. And so he called me up, and because he had heard about me and knew my alligator work, and he wanted to film that. And as we got to know one another, he came to understand that I had a lot of natural history knowledge and I could help with other storylines and I could fill out the alligator stories he had tried to put into these films. So we finished that educational film on the Okefenokee, which was like a 16, I can't remember now, it's like a 16 or 17 minute film or something like that. And they liked it a lot, I guess. And then they almost immediately came back with a suggestion that we make a TV special, which was a big deal back then because they would actually give you enough money to film for a couple of years, to, unlike today where they give you money to film for, 9 days and produce a 1 hour show.
Right.
But so they wanted us to make a 1 hour TV special about the Okefenokee. And so John accepted that offer and we started working on it. So he had quite a few difficulties with that film. One was that he was trying to take the film he had already made and just add to it and turn that into however many minutes we had to have, 54 or whatever, I can't remember anymore. And that was not going well. And then because it's National Geographic, they require having at least a quarter of the film has to be about people. It has to be people talking about what they're doing, or films about people, in this case, that used to live in the swamp and they're no longer there, and all that. And so we didn't have any of that. So we had to, John originally tried to put himself into the film as the filmmaker. And that was kind of awkward. And so then he decided to have me in the film as an alligator biologist that knew about alligators. And so that's how I ended up in that film. But I spent quite a bit of time on that. But that was a long time ago, so you're right. National Geographic, it was a very popular film. Somebody told me National Geo had told me it was the second or third most popular TV special ever, but like second only to Jane Goodall and one of her chimp films.
Wow.
And then somebody told me that they had been up to National Geographic headquarters in Washington, and that they were now saying my film was more successful. But I doubt that's true any longer now that Jane passed away. People probably have been searching out those films, but National Geographic never made a CD version of Realm of the Alligator. They did have the VHS tape, but they never made a CD. So, and they always had these kind of backhanded compliments when they would talk to me about the film. They would say, it's the least scientific film that we've ever made, but it's one of the most popular, and students still learn from it and that sort of thing. Well, and then the other thing they said about it was that it began to show its age over time. The things we were showing, the computers in the labs, or vehicles on the streets, those all started getting dated, and so they didn't think it really had what it needed to just keep putting it in a different format for selling. And so I'm sure you can still find a tape on eBay or Amazon or something, but you're right, you'd have to buy a tape and a VHS player to.
Like, I still find it on YouTube. If anybody knows how to record from that could probably at least get it in digital format. And I think I told you the first time we met that I found that video as a young biologist interested in crocodilians, and then after became a teacher, because it's more than gators, the Okefenokee swamp, the ecology of it, even the regeneration after the forest fires and all that, and in terms of natural cycles for an environment. I still show that thing. This is my 31st year showing that video. So yeah, maybe we do laugh at the computer. I like the sprocketed paper that you had to pull the perforations off, and people won't even know what I'm talking about, or the old green numbers that look like they were written in BASIC, the old computer language.
I can't watch it. I have like PTSD from looking at those scenes again and again and again.
But you kept a close relationship with the alligator farm after doing all that work there, didn't you?
Yeah, I still work with them as a scientific advisor. I was just there a few days ago. I've worked with the owner and the staff for more than 40 years now.
Wow. Yeah, so it's a long storied career. You mentioned that you're retired, but you're not slowing down. You're still doing research. Other than that, retirement good for you?
Yeah. I encourage anybody to retire.
I have to ask because I am going to be retiring June 26th. The date now is March 16th, so I'm just 3 months away from it. But then hopefully I'll be running into you more often in person down in Florida.
Yeah, that'd be good. The
So,
staff in the department I retired from have a little countdown clock that tells you the numbers of days and hours and minutes until your retirement. And when one of the staffs retires, they just pass that on to the next person. And it's been in multiple offices and
well,
departmental
now
offices.
there's apps for that. So I actually have my countdown on my phone right down to the time that the school day ends.
And the last bell rings.
Yeah, I'm just looking forward to get out of the formal education, especially at the high school level, because a lot of things have changed in 31 years. And
Oh, sure.
still don't plan on quitting yet. I want to come down and then hopefully do some more crocodilian conservation, and even if it's volunteer work with Croc Fest and so on. So
Yeah, no, that would be great.
I'll be around.
I encourage the retirement.
Yes. My wife's looking forward to that part, especially in Florida. We're tired of winter. We had a bad winter in New York this year. But then again, that was all the way down. I remember talking to Sean Heflick about how far the ice front went down, and we have friends in Miami that were seeing frost. So it was a rough winter, I think, for everybody. But I'll take 2 days of 20 degrees. Yeah, we had 20-inch snowstorms. I'm done with it.
Yeah, I think it got colder in South Florida this year than any year that I've lived here. And you know, that has an impact on obviously the green iguanas. Everybody makes fun of Florida and green iguanas dropping out of the trees because they're too cold and they're stunned. It kills the pythons too. It doesn't kill all of them, but it tends to kill big ones because the little ones can get into niches that give them a little bit of thermal protection, but the big ones are too big to find a spot to seek cover, and so they get too cold and die. And that's true of the American crocodiles down in Florida Bay and the Northern Keys as well. The big crocs often cannot withstand that cold, but the little ones get by because they can always tuck themselves into a spot.
Right.
Make it through a cold night.
Well, especially with the crocodiles, that's the northern part of their range. So sooner or later, they're going to reach that point where a cold winter is got to knock them back. I thought I remember reading back a long time ago that may be what happened with alligators. Did they once cross all the way into Virginia?
Well, the presence of alligators in Virginia is something that's even still kind of argued over.
Mm-hmm.
There are alligators in Virginia today. Nobody really lists Virginia as one of the states within their range. They've been finding alligators in Virginia for over 100 years. But, 100 years ago, people were driving to Florida and going on vacation, and you could go to stores and you could buy little baby alligators in cardboard boxes or little wood crates to take back with you as a pet, or you could have them mailed to you for $1. And then they had these alligators, and they didn't know what to do with them, or they'd start growing and they didn't have any place to keep them. So any wet spot in the environment, they would just go and throw them in. And, we've never really had the tools to take an alligator and figure out where it originally came from. And we probably never will now, because there's alligator farming across the Southeast, and those are all tied to the wild populations. So part of the management programs are to figure out how much reproduction there was in an area, like in the state of Florida or whatever. They'll figure out how many nests were put down, and they want to take half of all the productivity from the alligator population and give it to alligator farmers to hatch out those eggs and raise up those babies and produce a hide end skulls and all sorts of stuff that can attach an economic value to not only alligators, but to our wetland habitats as well. And so that's going on in Florida and Georgia and Louisiana and Texas. And some of these programs, like in Louisiana, their program's done a little differently than ours. They collect every wild egg they can find, give them to the farmers, and then these numbers keep changing. So I'm not even going to say a number here, but they have to raise up a certain proportion of those eggs, of the hatchlings from those eggs, raise them up, and then when they're whatever, 4 years old or whatever, or some length, 4 or 4.5 feet, they have to take a proportion of those back into the wild and release them to repopulate or to add a new generation to the gators that are already there. That's a concept of conservation through sustainable utilization, which is a hard message to give people. It's not an easy message like, don't cause wildfires, or
Right.
don't buy crocodile hide. In the old days, that's a simple message. It's much harder to explain to somebody how it benefits alligators and it benefits wild crocodiles if you buy a belt that is made out of that crocodile, or you buy cowboy boots made out of that alligator hide that's tied to one of these sustainable utilization management programs. That's a difficult thing to teach. I've been working for 30 years to get zoos to include that in their education programs, but they just are scared of it. They're scared of animal rights groups, and they're scared of people misinterpreting the message. And so it has helped many of our crocodilian species, but it's really difficult to sell that message to the public.
Yeah, I've had this conversation with lots of other people in the olden days. I mean, I say olden days, I'm 57. So even in my lifetime, ecology class was about a population. It's an endangered population, not an endangered individual. And now everybody wants to save every individual, which is great, which is noble. But I mean, sustainable hunting, economics is going to encourage people to protect things. And a friend of both of ours once got in, I wouldn't say trouble. He once got asked to remove a sign from one of his traveling exhibits because it said, save a crocodile by a purse.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. So I was in that traveling show, but I also helped the Sun edit all those signs. And that was like the second or third place, or maybe even the first place, that they were installing those traveling displays, and they wanted them to take that sign down. Yes.
Yeah, that was, I think he said, the Museum of Natural History right here in New York.
Yeah.
So again, they didn't want to deal with the.
Well, they had actually already had 2 or 3 people marching around in front of the museum trying to rally the troops against that sort of thing. So,
yeah,
everybody's scared of negative publicity these days.
Well, if anybody's still watching and stayed on this long, you can go back and look up my interview with Clyde Peeling from Reptiland, where we highlight his Crocs Alive exhibit. And Clyde's, just like you said, teaching it as a biologist, the importance of saving an animal through economic importance. So I don't think Clyde's going to get mad at me sharing that idea.
Clyde's
So,
got a very pragmatic mind. Yeah. He's a wonderful fellow.
I keep bringing up, I keep acting like I'm getting old, but
love
it's
him.
just amazing how the conversation goes. I talk to people that don't know who Clyde Peeling is. I'll talk to people that might not know who you are. And then you bring up Walter Offenberg and Ross Allen, and it's going back to all the books I read when I was a kid. So
Yeah.
I really appreciate you spending the time with us. And unless there's anything else you want to share, I'm going to let you go.
Okay.
All right, Ken?
We can do it again sometime.
I hope to. Maybe next time we'll do it live.
Okay, if I can get my computer to work.
All right. Take care, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark.
All right.
I'll
Bye-bye.
see you later.
Bye.